Europe is entering the most dangerous 72 hours since the Euro 2012 crisis. Because the Italian government has just sent a cold message to Berlin. If Germany does not withdraw its financial control plan, Italy will activate 3 measures that could paralyze the entire European Union. This is no longer the usual diplomatic back and forth, not a technical debate about the budget, and it's not just a minor disagreement in meetings in Brussels. What is happening, at least in the way many people are perceiving it, resembles a direct confrontation between 2 economic pillars of Europe: Germany in the north and Italy in the south. Some observers say that if tensions escalate, the impact could spread beyond politics. The bond market, the euro, even the European financial system, all could be affected. So what in Berlin's plan caused such a strong reaction from Rome? To understand that, we have to go back to the moment everything started: Italy's 72-hour ultimatum to Germany. In early March 2026, Rome unexpectedly sent a 72-hour ultimatum directly to Berlin. You heard it right, 72 hours, exactly the length of a long weekend in the English countryside. But this time, it carries the weight of determining the fate of 450 million people. Rome has set a countdown clock on the negotiating table. Each tick-tock seems to be shaking the foundations from Paris to Madrid. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is not talking about soulless numbers this time. She is talking about the right to self-determination regarding what each Italian family's dinner will be. It's interesting to see the diplomatic smiles at the Rome conference in January vanish faster than the foam on a beer in a London pub. Just a few weeks ago, they were shaking hands and smiling while signing cooperation agreements. Yet now, this ultimatum appears like a unilateral divorce after decades of enduring tacit imposition. Some people said that the atmosphere that day was reminiscent of the days before the Eurozone debt crisis in 2012, a familiar feeling. But this time it seems heavier. According to the report, at the Eurogroup meeting, the Italian finance minister stood up and said something that left the entire room in silence. Italy does not accept the status of a servant, a bitter irony for the sluggish bureaucratic machine in Brussels, where a decision on the curvature of cucumbers could take years, but now they only have 3 days to prevent a complete collapse. In particular, this confrontation is putting the annual trade volume of over 160 billion euros at a hair's breadth risk. This enormous figure is the lifeblood connecting car factories in Germany and machine shops in Italy. If there is no agreement by next Monday morning, all trade activities will fall into a state of legal freeze. At that time, the supply chain of goods you consume daily will be immediately disrupted, and the price to pay will be directly reflected in each of our grocery bills. This ultimatum is like the Italians just sent a weighty affirmation. We would rather be free in poverty than rich in chains. We are standing at the starting line of a collapse that perhaps no one can turn back from anymore. So what is this 72-hour ultimatum really about? A tough negotiation tactic? Or a sign that trust within the EU is starting to crack? And the bigger question, what in Berlin's plan caused such a strong reaction from Rome? If you are interested in the geopolitical stories behind the big headlines, consider subscribing to the channel to follow the developments that mainstream media seems to be deliberately overlooking. But why did Rome choose this moment to pull the trigger? The answer does not lie in a momentary impulse. It lies within a classified dossier codenamed the Berlin Wall, a plan that Germany never wanted the world to see. Perhaps the story began when an internal memo, allegedly originating from the office of German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, unexpectedly appeared in diplomatic channels in Rome. The official name of the document sounds quite innocuous: European Fiscal Stability and Integration Framework. According to the content mentioned in the initial analyses, this plan aims to establish a new mechanism to tighten fiscal discipline in the Eurozone. After the public debt crisis in the early 2010s, talking about budget discipline is not unfamiliar. However, the detail that particularly caught Rome's attention lies in a rather specific number: 115%. According to the proposal, any country in the Eurozone with a public debt ratio exceeding 115% of GDP may have to transfer budgetary control to a new fiscal oversight agency based in Frankfurt. On paper, This sounds like a fairly reasonable economic formula, a technical mechanism to ensure that countries do not go too far in public spending. With a debt ratio reaching 137.1% by 2026, Italy suddenly became the prime target of a silent takeover. Imagine, just because of debt, you have to hand over full control of your wallet to a supervisory board based all the way in Frankfurt. A council of 9 experts, but 6 of them are chosen by Germany and its closest allies. The most controversial aspect is that this mechanism is said to have the power to review and even veto national budget plans before they are approved by Parliament. For many Italians, that detail touches a very sensitive point, as the budget is not just a set of figures, but also an expression of political self-determination. For an Italian who has been waiting for a pension after a lifetime of dedication, that money will now be decided by people sitting in air-conditioned rooms in Frankfurt. People who have probably never set foot in a market in Naples. Moreover, according to some analytical sources, this proposal may have been prepared more than 18 months before it was leaked, leading many to believe that this is not a spontaneous idea, but rather part of a larger debate about the future of the European Union. We are witnessing the shadows of 2010 again, but this time with a more ruthless and tighter control. Does this system believe that debt is the perfect excuse to force southern European countries to kneel? It is estimated that if implemented, 70% of social decisions, from building hospitals to energy support, will no longer be in the hands of representatives elected by the Italian people. This confidential document is not a proposal for cooperation. It is an economic sentence that Rome will probably never agree to sign. Does Europe need a stronger fiscal discipline mechanism to protect the euro? Or could that bring the EU closer to a model of centralized financial power? Perhaps that is also the reason why the reaction from Rome was so strong. But if we look more closely at the mentioned memorandum, many say that the real shocker does not lie in the budget control. What has sparked the controversy lies in another clause, a clause related to strategic assets worth approximately 340 billion euros. In your opinion, is Berlin trying to save a sinking ship, or are they executing the most spectacular takeover in European history? Please share the perspective of someone experienced in the comments section below. However, losing control of the budget is just the tip of the iceberg. Because when they turn to item number 7 of the document, the Italians are truly shocked. There, they no longer talk about imaginary numbers on paper, but about the acquisition of real assets worth hundreds of billions of euros, things that were once considered the untouchable heritage of the nation. If the previous part made many people in Rome uncomfortable, the next part of the document might really make them sit up straight, because beneath the familiar technical language of European fiscal reports, there is another clause. A clause that sounds more like the language of banking than of politics. It is called by a rather long name, Strategic Asset Collateralization Requirement. Simply put, it is a mechanism that requires collateral assets. According to some sources analyzing leaked documents, this proposal suggests that if a country in the Eurozone needs to continue receiving financial support amid strained public debt, it may have to pledge part of its strategic assets as collateral. In theory, that's not something too unusual. Banks do this every day when extending credit. But when that concept is applied to a sovereign nation, the story takes on a completely different hue. According to estimates appearing in the memorandum, the total value of assets that could be included in this guarantee mechanism amounts to approximately 340 billion euros. That's not a small accounting figure tucked away in the corner of a balance sheet. It is almost equivalent to the entire annual budget of some medium-sized economies in the European Union. And as analysts in Rome began to take a closer look at the list of mentioned assets, the concerns seemed to become even clearer. Among them is Eni, the energy group that plays a crucial role in the Mediterranean gas pipelines. There is Leonardo, Italy's leading defense contractor with many contracts related to NATO. In addition, there are strategic seaports, transportation networks, and some important telecommunications infrastructure. In other words, these are not peripheral assets that can be easily replaced. That is the backbone of the country's industry and energy. According to the described mechanism, These assets can be used as collateral for financial stability programs if public debt is deemed unsustainable. Technically, it can be presented as a risk management tool. But in Rome, many people see it differently. They see a scenario in which the iconic companies of the nation, over time, could become bargaining chips in a debt crisis. For some Italians, this evokes unpleasant memories of the strong waves of privatization following past crises. The only difference this time is that the question is no longer about selling assets to reform the economy, but whether those strategic assets can be pulled into a financial mechanism beyond the control of the national parliament. The European Union was once built on the promise that the nations of the continent would no longer have to fear each other's economic power. But now, the debate revolves around a rather classic question. Who really holds the keys to the ports, power plants, and strategic infrastructure? Some people call it a necessary fiscal reform. Some others see it as a form of sophisticated power bargaining. So what do you think? Is this mechanism merely a reasonable debt crisis prevention measure? Or does it set a new precedent for how EU countries handle each other's strategic assets? When Rome issued the 72-hour ultimatum, many initially thought it was just a strong negotiating tactic. In European politics, stern warnings are sometimes just a way to pull the other party back to the negotiating table. But according to what was revealed later, the message from Rome did not stop at mere words. Behind it are three response options that some analysts describe as nuclear levers in economics, not because they are immediately destructive, but because they can shake the entire system if used simultaneously. The first option sounds simple but carries significant weight: vetoing the EU budget. Few people outside Brussels realize that the European Union's long-term budget, a multi-annual financial framework worth around 1.2 trillion euros, requires the consensus of all member states. If one country says no, the entire colossal administrative machine of the EU could be brought to a halt. That means agricultural subsidies, regional development funds, cross-border infrastructure projects, all could be stalled. In other words, just one signature from Rome could significantly slow down the Brussels machinery. Sometimes the greatest power in politics is not the ability to act, but the ability to prevent things from happening. The second option relates to energy. And this is where the story becomes much more practical. After the decline of Russian gas supplies in recent years, Europe has begun seeking new supply routes from the Mediterranean and North Africa. Many of those routes pass through Italy. Projects like the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, along with future hydrogen plans, position Italy as a central valve in the southern energy flow. If Rome decides to limit cooperation or prioritize supply to other markets, the German industry, which is already under pressure from high energy costs, may face even tougher challenges. There's no need to completely shut off the valve. Sometimes, just tightening the flow slightly is enough for the market to start reacting. The third option is more financially complex, and perhaps the one that has caught the attention of trading floors in Frankfurt and London the most: activating the debt restructuring clause in the ESM mechanism. If a large country like Italy requests a debt restructuring conference at the Eurozone level, the entire European bond market will have to reevaluate risk. We are talking about trillions of euros in assets held in pension funds, banks, and insurance companies. Just that possibility alone is enough to make investors start to play defense. There is an interesting irony here. The European Union was built so that nations no longer had to use tools to exert pressure on each other. But over time, its very complex system has created new levers, sometimes much more sophisticated than what previous generations imagined. So, in your opinion, are these choices smart negotiation tactics, or signs that the tensions in the EU are entering a new phase? If you enjoy analyses like this, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the stories behind global politics and economics. Because when these levers are put on the table, financial markets often react very quickly. And in this case, it seems they have already started to react. In the next section, we will look at the first signals from the market, numbers that suggest investors may be preparing for a seismic shift in the Eurozone. If politics is where words are spoken, then the financial markets are where those words are immediately tested. And the interesting, or perhaps concerning, thing is that markets often react before politicians can finish their speeches. In this case, the first signals have started to appear. One of the most closely monitored indicators during the European debt crisis is the yield spread between Italian and German government bonds, commonly referred to as the BTP bund spread. Simply put, it is the difference in borrowing costs between a country considered stable and a country deemed riskier. In recent days, this figure has surged from around 72-95 basis points to approximately 245-248 basis points in a very short period. For those who have been following the Eurozone crisis, that number sounds quite familiar. It is close to what the market experienced during the most tense period of 2012, when the future of the euro was in question. This change may seem small if you only look at a few numbers on the screen. But in the financial world, a few hundred basis points can sometimes resemble the change in pressure before a storm. It's not the storm, but it signals that something is forming. And when a country's borrowing costs rise, the ripple effect often starts quite quickly. Budgets come under pressure, banks become more cautious, and investors begin to ask more questions. Not only the bond market reacts, the euro also started to fluctuate. In some recent trading sessions, the exchange rate has been recorded to have decreased from around $1.08 down to nearly $1.02. A level of fluctuation significant enough to catch the attention of currency trading desks. In moments like these, investors often turn to more familiar places. Money flows are starting to shift towards the US dollar and the Swiss franc, two currencies considered safe havens whenever the market feels unstable. Here is something quite interesting about market psychology. Investors do not need to be certain that a crisis will occur. As long as they think there is a possibility of a crisis occurring, defensive behavior has already begun. And when trillions of euros in assets are managed by investment funds, banks, and pension funds, even a small change in expectations can create significant waves. Perhaps that's why many people in the financial world half-jokingly say that the market is like a seismograph. It doesn't cause earthquakes, but it is often the first to tremble when the ground begins to shift. And at this moment, that machine seems to be vibrating quite noticeably. Of course, no one knows for sure where these signals will lead. Perhaps everything will cool down after a few rounds of negotiations. It could also just be a short-term market reaction to attention-grabbing headlines. But there is also a possibility, albeit a small one, that these numbers are reflecting a more uncomfortable truth. Trust in Europe's financial structure is being tested. If we look back at the whole story, what is noteworthy perhaps does not lie solely in a fiscal plan, a 7-2-hour ultimatum, or a few numbers on the bond market. What is more noteworthy is the feeling that a system once built to create stability is now having to self-examine. For decades, the European Union has been seen as one of the boldest political projects of the 20th century. A continent, once divided by war, has tried to build a common structure, a common market, common laws, and with many countries, even a common currency. For many who witnessed the EU's expansion in the 1990s and 2000s, it was a period that gave the feeling that history had finally learned its lesson. Perhaps the confrontation between Rome and Berlin will eventually be resolved in a few rounds of closed-door negotiations. It might also leave a small crack in the power structure of Europe. Or in a more pessimistic scenario, it could force the EU to rethink how to balance financial discipline and national sovereignty. Is this merely a temporary policy dispute between two major economies, or a sign that the EU's power structure is entering a new phase of adjustment? And in a union of dozens of countries with different interests, what is the reasonable boundary between common financial discipline and the self-determination of each country? If you find this video helps you understand better what is happening behind the major headlines, please like, share this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The big stories of the world often do not lie in the headlines, but in the details behind them. The content in this video is built based on reports, market data, and analyses from various sources at the time of production. Some information is estimated or interpreted from public sources. The video is intended for informational and discussion purposes, not as financial advice, investment guidance, or a definitive prediction of future developments. As usual in international economics and politics, the context can change rapidly, and viewers should consult multiple sources of information before making any decisions.